There comes a moment when the world's noise becomes unbearable, not because it's louder than before, but because within us, something begins to crave silence. It's an ancient, almost forgotten call. The same call that led Jung to raise, stone by stone, his tower on the shores of Lake Zurich. He didn't build it to escape the world, but to rediscover the world within himself. We live in a time where noise has become the norm, and withdrawal suspect. People talk a lot about productivity and very little about presence. There is always a notification, a comparison, an urgency. And little by little the sacred disappears, not because God has left, but because we forgot to leave a space where he might dwell. The Bollingen Tower was not a monument, it was a mirror of the soul. Jung said that there he became what I truly am. Each stone represented a fragment of his own psyche being reorganized, integrating shadow and light, conscious and unconscious. That tower is also a living metaphor for all of us, an invitation to raise an inner space where the self can breathe. Perhaps you feel that call too, the desire to step back for a moment, not to escape but to listen to yourself. Inner retreat doesn't require mountains or distant temples. It begins when we decide to honor silence as a form of invisible prayer. Today, we'll walk together in this return to the soul. We'll talk about how to build and sustain this sacred space within, how to transform silence into a ritual of healing and solitude into a companion. Because sometimes the true awakening doesn't happen in the clamor of enlightenment, but in the serenity of someone who has finally learned to rest in themselves. Chapter 1. The Bollingen Tower and the Archetype of Withdrawal. When Jung felt his soul drifting from its essence, he didn't seek new teachers or hide in theories. He turned to the earth. He shaped stones, raised walls, lit fires. Thus, Bollingen was born, a simple, almost primitive tower built with his own hands. There was no luxury, only silence and presence. There, he said, time dissolves and the being returns to eternity. The Bollingen Tower was not just a house, it was a living image of the unconscious. Jung understood that to integrate the vastness of the psyche, it wasn't enough to think about it. It had to be inhabited. Each stone set was a symbolic act, a silent confession of the soul seeking to take root. He saw the construction not as an escape from the world, but as the deepest act of belonging to himself. In depth psychology, this tower represents the archetype of withdrawal, the instinctive impulse to return to the inner source when the mind scatters. Every human being, at some point in life, feels this homesickness, not for a physical home, but for an inner space where the soul can rest. It is the call to rebuild our own invisible temple. Withdrawal is not isolation. It is communion with what is essential. In conscious solitude, the soul reorganizes. External voices dissolve, and a new way of listening is revealed. A listening that doesn't come from the ears, but from the heart. It is in this space that the unconscious speaks through symbols, dreams, and silences. Bollingen was, for Jung, the womb of his individuation. There he drew mandalas, wrote reflections, and watched the sunrise mirrored on the water. Each morning was a rite, each gesture a wordless prayer. He understood that spirit needs form, and that sacred form is born of conscious action. When we look at his tower, we realize it reflects something in us, a forgotten memory that we, too, have an inner architecture waiting to be rebuilt. We may not raise stone walls, but we do erect invisible ones made of attention, silence, and presence. True retreat begins when the soul decides to return to its center, when life ceases to be a battlefield and becomes a space of contemplation. At that moment, the world stops being an enemy and becomes a mirror. Bollingen reminds us, withdrawal is not renunciation, it is reintegration. It is the moment when the modern person, weary of noise and distraction, remembers that the temple has always been within, waiting only for the moment to be inhabited. Chapter 2. The world's noise and the loss of sacred space. There is a kind of noise that doesn't come from outside. It lives within us, a constant hum of demands, comparisons, and expectations. The modern world has become a chorus of overlapping voices, each shouting what we should be, feel, and achieve. And without noticing, we start to inhabit this noise as if it were our own thinking. Technology, hurry, and overstimulation have stolen from us the simplest and most sacred gesture, listening to ourselves. The soul, which speaks in whispers, does not compete with notifications. It falls silent, and it is in this stifled silence that the feeling of emptiness is born, not the fertile emptiness of withdrawal, but the emptiness of self-forgetfulness. We live in an era where distraction has become an addiction and introspection, almost a heresy. Everything pushes us outward. The chase for approval, the race for relevance, the illusion that being busy is the same as being alive. But the soul is not nourished by speed. It flowers in the interval between one thought and the next, in the pause where time stops being rush and becomes presence again. Jung said, "He who looks outside dreams. He who looks inside awakens." The world's noise keeps us sleepwalking, awake only on the surface, disconnected from depth. The loss of sacred space begins there, when we trade dialogue with the unconscious for the automatic repetition of external patterns. In ancient times, civilizations understood the power of silence. There were temples, gardens, chambers for retreat. The sacred had a place. Today, that place must be reinvented within us. The modern temple is invisible, built of pauses. It rises when you decide, even for a few minutes, not to react to chaos, but to observe it. When you dim the lights, turn off the phone, and allow yourself to exist without performing. The mind, without the space of silence, falls ill. It becomes like a house without windows, full of echo but without air. The ego, seeking control, tries to fill everything, while the soul only wants to breathe. That's why so many feel tired even after resting, lonely even when surrounded by people, empty even amid achievements. Nothing is missing on the outside. What's missing is presence on the inside. The world's noise is inevitable, but it is possible to learn not to get lost in it. When we recognize silence as a right of the soul, something shifts. A kind of stillness arises that doesn't depend on circumstances. It is the beginning of the return, the moment when the ordinary person starts to recall the sacred within. Chapter 3. Silence as a ritual of healing. Silence is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of something deeper, a listening that turns inward. It is the place where the soul speaks in its original language, before words, before explanations. That's why when we truly approach silence, we feel discomfort. The ego fears what it cannot control. But it is precisely there, in that discomfort, that the work of healing begins. Jung understood silence as a psychic womb, a space where the unconscious can reorganize what the ego cannot resolve on its own. It is the interval between thoughts, the moment when defenses lower and the self reconnects with what is essential. To be silent, therefore, is not to escape. It is to allow life to flow again where it was blocked. In our culture, silence is seen as lack, as a void to be filled. But true silence is fullness. In it, emotions settle, wounds reveal themselves, and inner wisdom awakens. When there is no more noise, we can finally hear the murmur of the unconscious, the voice that has always been there, waiting to be recognized. Turning silence into ritual is the beginning of the inner retreat. You don't need to isolate yourself for days. You only need to be whole for a few moments. You can start simply. Sit in a quiet place, breathe deeply, feel your body, watch the flow of thoughts without fighting them. Little by little, the inner noise begins to dissolve, like snow melting in the sun. And in that melting, subtle insights arise, forgotten memories, emotions asking to be heard, intuitions sprouting like seeds long dormant. Silence is a medicine that acts without haste. It doesn't require understanding, only presence. The more we allow ourselves to dwell in it, the more we feel that something greater sustains us, something that cannot be explained, only recognized. Silence returns us to the breathing of life, to unity with the whole. Jung said that the soul needs solitude as the body needs food, and it is in silence that this solitude becomes fertile, the space where the ego bows before the soul and the human meets the divine. Healing begins when we stop trying to fix what we are and simply listen to what needs to be felt. If you wish, try it now. Close your eyes for a few seconds. Breathe and feel the weight of your shoulders, the air moving in and out. There is nothing to do, only to be. This moment is your temple. Silence is the door, and the soul, at last, begins to answer. Chapter 4. Building Your Inner Tower. Jung's Bollingen Tower was not only a physical refuge, it was a daily practice of presence. Each stone laid represented a thought reorganized, a fear embraced, a fragment of the soul returning to its place. In the same way, building your own inner tower is a symbolic gesture, creating within yourself a space where the sacred can dwell. But what does it mean in modern life to raise this invisible tower? It is not about isolation or escape. Building the inner tower is about creating small islands of presence in the middle of the sea of stimuli. It is about turning simple acts into conscious rituals. Perhaps your tower begins at dawn, when you light a candle and breathe in silence before looking at your phone. Or when, at day's end, you dim the lights and write in a notebook everything your heart couldn't say. Each such gesture is a stone set, each pause a foundation. The inner tower is constructed through subtle choices, through the no you give to noise and the yes you offer to your own rhythm. It is an architecture made of attention and gentleness. You don't need free time, you need intention. When intention is present, even washing the dishes can become a ritual, a moment when consciousness observes the movement of the hands and senses the stillness beneath the action. Jung said that spirit needs form, and the most sacred form is the one born from the everyday. The inner tower is the temple where the ordinary becomes sacred. There are no rigid rules, only a silent commitment to the soul, not to abandon yourself in the midst of haste. Create your symbolic space, a corner of your home, a plant, an altar, a moment of solitude. Allow yourself to tend this space as one tends an inner garden. When the mind scatters, return to it, not to flee, but to remember who you are. Perhaps this tower has no doors or windows because it is made of consciousness. It expands each time you choose to be present, each time you decide to listen rather than react, to feel rather than explain. And little by little, the world's noise stops breaking in. The tower becomes a vibrational field, a space of peace you carry with you, wherever you are. And now I invite you to reflect. What are the stones of your tower? What small rituals sustain your silence? Share in the comments if you wish. Sometimes sharing a symbol is a way of remembering we are not alone in this construction, because in the end, every soul seeks the same thing, an inner place where the self can rest, listen, and simply exist. Chapter 5. Solitude as Spiritual Initiation. There comes a point on the inner path when silence deepens and turns into solitude. Many fear this moment because it seems like the opposite of life. But it is precisely there that the soul begins to reveal itself. Solitude, when conscious, is not the absence of love. It is the field where love matures. It is the space where we stop seeking outside what has always been within. Jung understood solitude as an initiatory rite. He said that when the soul is ready to grow, it separates us from external voices so we can hear the inner voice. It is an uncomfortable process because solitude strips us bare. Without social masks, Without the roles we play, we are confronted with what we avoid seeing: shadow, fear, the feeling of emptiness. But it is in this confrontation that individuation begins, the reunion of the human and the divine within us. Clarissa Pinkola Estes writes that solitude is not abandonment, it is the shelter of the wild soul. In that shelter, we learn to become whole again. Solitude invites us to a radical intimacy with ourselves, to look at our wounds without hurry, to welcome what hurts without trying to fix it, to love what is still under reconstruction. It teaches us that true presence doesn't depend on the company of others, but on the capacity to remain with ourselves with tenderness and patience. During solitude, the unconscious works silently. Dreams surface, memories reappear, emotions take shape. It is the period of the dark night of the soul, when everything seems lost. But in truth, something sacred is being gestated. Like Jung at Bollingen, each of us needs this time of withdrawal to reorder inner chaos and allow the new to be revealed. Spiritual solitude is different from emotional isolation. Isolation is born of fear. Conscious solitude is born of courage. It is the space where the ego loosens and the soul breathes, where we stop defining ourselves through external connections and begin to be nourished by inner presence. In that state, the world doesn't disappear. It changes perspective. We start seeing others not as fillers, but as reflections of our own wholeness. The initiation solitude offers is quiet and profound. It teaches us to be with what is, to trust the invisible, to realize that true companionship begins when we stop running from ourselves. And one day, without warning, something shifts. Emptiness stops being a threat and becomes space. Silence stops being loneliness and becomes communion. And you finally understand that the inner retreat is not the end of the path. It is the beginning of a life where being with yourself is the most sacred of encounters. Chapter 6. Integration. Living the retreat in the middle of the world. There comes a time when withdrawal fulfills its purpose. Not so we remain isolated, but so we learn to carry the temple with us. True spirituality is not a refuge away from life. It is a way of walking through it with awareness. To integrate the inner retreat is to discover that silence doesn't need walls. It can live in the heart even amid the noise of the streets. Jung returned from Bollingen transformed, yet never disconnected from the world. His tower was not a hideout, but a point of return. Each time he went back to civilization, he carried with him the serenity he had cultivated there. This is the purpose of retreat. Not to flee life, but to learn to live it differently with one's gaze rooted in the soul. Integrating retreat means remembering yourself while the world calls you outward. It means walking among the voices and still hearing the inner voice. It means acting without getting lost in action. It is living the everyday as spiritual practice, seeing the sacred in the simple, the divine in the imperfect, the eternal in the instant. The modern monk does not live in monasteries. They work, love, suffer, and dream like everyone else, but they carry a different presence. Their mind may be in motion, but their soul remains anchored. This is the true inner tower, the invisible axis that supports the self amid chaos. Nothing external can destroy it, because it was built in silence and truth. You can cultivate this presence throughout the day. When someone speaks, practice listening with your whole body. When traffic stops, use the moment as a pause to breathe. When fear arises, remember the stillness you already know. The tower is always there, within you, waiting to be inhabited. Integration is when the spiritual and the human cease to be opposites. Life becomes the path itself, and each gesture a rite. Silence then stops being a refuge and becomes a vibrant field that permeates all things. It is the state in which one can laugh, work, love, and still feel the presence of the invisible. The inner retreat doesn't end, it expands. Each time you choose calm over hurry, love over defense, truth over appearance, the tower grows. And the world that once was noise becomes music, because the person who has found themselves no longer needs to flee, they carry the sacred within. Conclusion: the return to the soul. There comes a moment when the homeward journey ends, and we realize we had never left. The inner retreat is not a place to be reached, but a state that reveals itself when we stop resisting what we are. The inner tower is not made of stone, but of presence. And the silence that once seemed empty is now home. Carl Jung said that the meeting with one's own self is the meeting with the divine. And perhaps that is what we're all seeking. Not a perfect life, but a space where we can rest in authenticity. The true sacred is simple: a mindful breath, a word spoken in truth, a moment of quiet gratitude before what is. When the world's noise intensifies, remember the tower. It lives in you. It's in the pauses between tasks, in the gaze that turns inward, in the choice not to react when everything invites haste. The inner retreat does not require distance. It requires presence. And every time you return to the now with awareness, you rekindle the fire in your invisible temple. Perhaps this is Jung's great lesson. The human spirit needs roots as much as wings. And solitude, when well lived, returns both to us. It teaches us to inhabit life with lightness, with reverence, with a kind of quiet love that needs no witnesses. If this video resonated with something in you, share in the comments. What is the space where your soul rests? How have you been cultivating your inner retreat in the midst of the world? Breathe, remain. The tower is already raised, and within it the soul rests in peace.